Okay, I think it's.
Yeah. Hello, this is Sanfeng.
And this is Gino, and we are doing the collective narrative quality updates for winter 2018. So we will use this time to talk about what we learned this quarter on the project, and we also want to go through some of our key findings and as well as design arguments. And later on, we will demonstrate one of the studies we are currently conducting. And lastly, we will ending with some goals and next quarter planning. Okay, so we did it by spring, so I think it's easier for us to kind of consolidate what we learned for each spring. The first spring is more about like reading up on what Eunice's project was out about and meeting with relative project groups to learn about this project in depth about what's in stake for us. So let me just navigate to the spring log. Uh, we spent a lot of time meeting with Ryan, with Eunice, with Addison and Jenny just to go over like the micro ideas of how collective experience API collective narrative is all about. And that's pretty much for the first spring, which is only a week. And the first spring, we dig into the current technologies, some kind of related work that contains the components of collective narrative. So the idea here is we want to explore how the general concepts of shared community story or like interaction forming to a narrative are actually implemented in the current social media. And then we each did our study on 7 different current technologies, and we find them mostly remotely related to forming a community narrative. It's more about like the traditional way of post, like, and comment type of social interaction. And then we created some paper prototype, just try to explore the idea of how can we explore the design space of collective narrative. And we built around the idea of like a travel. So suppose a person travel from Chicago to New York, and another person takes over and travel from New York to like say Washington D.C. And then their entire encounter and what they see along the trip coming together to build a narrative. So I think the paper prototype doesn't really have any optimistic part to it, but we actually did some of our key findings, such as how can we actually combine the experience of 2 different person but in a similar situation. So that's where the idea of situation trigger first come to our mind, and that's really important for us to scaffold the problem of designing the collective experience idea. And moving on to the second spring is more pondering and like thinking about the problem statement and how can we really capture the user struggle and the user's pain point. And we use 2 kind of social media to illustrate the idea. The first one is Facebook. The second one is Reddit, where Facebook is more like traditional social media, like user to user interaction, and Reddit is like one to many. So you join a community Reddit, and then you have some kind of interaction and narrative between you yourself and the group of users on Reddit. And based off that, we kind of formulate our problem statement to be more focused in between the design spaces. So something that's untapped based on the optimistic part of like narrative forming. And later on, we formulate some design arguments based on user feedback. So what do we mean by user feedback is if we go back to the spring video. So we talked to different users about their pain points for using social media, and we did some readings on the idea of social mental space and how people are connected through those like psychological realms. And then we think in order to really capture the idea of building a narrative based on kind of certain type of interaction, it is important for our design to have some key features which we will go through later on, and those are our key design arguments.
In Sprint 3, we conducted a study to test one of our design prototypes. And in this case, the prototype was a platform that would allow users to share both their best moments and their worst moments. And their main method of doing this would be done through anonymously. So what we did was we came up with an idea for a system in which users would be able to post um, small samples of some moments in their lives, and they could do it completely anonymously, and other users would be allowed to reply to these users anonymously. And what we found through the study was that most users found that they were more likely to respond to other posts that were done in a negative light. So, for example, in most of our categories in our study, we had several examples. For example, body image, social status, academic performance, etc. And in almost every single case that we studied, the user chose to reach out to someone who supposedly had been having a bad moment. And that really helped us in terms of understanding what users really connected with and emphasized with when connecting with strangers. After this, we used this feedback to create a Keynote UI prototype to kind of illustrate what we found from the study. And we decided to increment on this through the idea of threads, in which each user would have a different thread for each topic that they found difficult. For example, someone might be feeling down about their career, which would be completely different from their relationship status. And in this case, they would have multiple threads related to these. And again, every single conversation would be anonymous. In Sprint 4, we conducted our status update, which kind of pivoted to focus on the idea of smaller ideas building towards a larger narrative. Because one of the things that we found was in our previous design prototype, these smaller ideas didn't really add up to a collective narrative over time. So a lot of the feedback that we got was that instead of focusing on communications through words and chat, like typical social media platforms, instead we should focus on the idea of connecting with others through actions. And so during the status update, we tried to figure out which types of actions and which types of stories would be best fit. And we decided to come up with another design prototype that would be based around the idea of running to make art. In Sprint 5, we followed through on this by designing a cognitive walkthrough, in the sense that we designed an entire application where users would log on and then, with very minimal effort, be able to create art through their simple act of running. Furthermore, because Sprint 5 is very short, we began to prepare our end-of-quarter deliverables, including our updated cognitive walkthrough, our canvas, and our plans for next quarter. So now we're going to start talking about our design arguments, and we're going to start with our problem statement, which is that users want to cultivate meaningful connections with other users, but they feel inadequate about their social media persona, as well as their inability to contribute to their online community.
So as we mentioned before, we want to explore some of the key design arguments so that we can answer like some of the neat findings we did earlier on in the quarter. And we come up with 4 pretty important design arguments, that some of which we already tested, but some of which we want to use our future study to further iterating on. So here they are. First one, we want to make the platform to have a very low activation energy for the user to participate. So in the sense that the user are both experience creators and participants, and the activity to participate itself shouldn't be very intrusive to like the normal way they should be doing this type of activity. So in the case of running, you don't want to interfere too much about what the user set out to do. So to just have like a good workout, you don't want to have your design to come in a way that prevents them to have like this kind of experience. So it should be like complementing in nature, not really like interleaving and like intrusive. The second thing is we want the platform to really offer the opportunity to have opportunistic interaction between the users. And this part is kind of inherited from the idea of CE API, whereby you roll experience and allow different users to participate at the same time. And this is also true in the case of collective narrative platform, because the key idea of this platform is we are able to continue on a certain type of opportunistic interaction. And we can't do it without having this particular feature to offer opportunistic interaction. So hope that makes sense. And then we want to move on to the third.
Yeah, so third, in addition to promoting interactions between different users, we want to be able to frame these interactions to tell a community story. And we found that in some of our previous design prototypes, for example, the travel idea, these interactions existed and they were opportunistic, but they didn't build together to build a story of the community. So we want a way to kind of contribute towards a larger narrative rather than just having a collection of separate interactions. Fourth, we do want a way for users to be both experienced participants and experienced creators. And what we mean by that is the fact that they're rewarded not by how much they contribute, but the fact that they contributed in the first place. And this is a example. This is a finding that we found from our other study in the best moments and worst moments prototype. In the sense that a lot of users did not want to contribute because they felt that what they had to offer was not as up to par as some other users. So in this case, we want to celebrate the fact that they stepped up and contributed something rather than comparing them to the contributions of other users. Next, we decided to make a cognitive walkthrough of our design prototype. In this case, the design prototype was an application/platform that allowed users to connect through the activity of running. We tested one user to get their first thoughts on this. And in general, the feedback was pretty positive. They liked the idea of connecting with a stranger across the globe and be able to share the experience of running with them. They also liked the idea of being able to see a map of the locations in the world that other runners were in, and just kind of having like a data visualization of local landmarks all around the world. There was also some other feedback about what they didn't like. And one thing that this person said was the idea that shapes were kind of arbitrary as a basis for each pattern, and they prefer something more high level or more user intuitive. So that's something that we're going to be looking into next quarter. But overall, both the feedback that we received as well as my partner and I, we both feel that we're in a optimistic situation right now.
Okay, so now we want to move on to what we are planning out to do for next quarter. So this quarter has been a lot of like thinking and contemplation on what the problem serves to really solve one kind of some user struggle and pain points, and how some of the key design features should carry over to actually help us to do that, and data of need finding to verify those design arguments. And now, going on to next quarter, we want to focus more on the technology part and actually making the idea to be more tangible in building out to a physical, like a digital prototype that actually works. So we have three main things we want to focus on next quarter. So the first thing is we want to run the cognitive walkthrough for the running as art idea, ready to test the viability of the design arguments. So the four key things we talked about, plus a few others we had, and I want to see whether they satisfies the user's need. So, thinking this about like we already have this set of design arguments, and we want to see how user responds to the certain interaction that is constructed based on those design arguments. I want to see how user reacts to this particular interface, and whether they get out what they want from this kind of experience. So this is more about like a verifying phase. And the second thing is we want to build a UI prototype, and we want to test on user to firstly verify the interface arguments, and secondly to see this interface really implements those design arguments we kind of figured out in our first step. So thinking this as like a building on to design arguments we verify in the first step using the walkthrough, and building this prototype help us to really try to implement those features, implement those design arguments in the interface. And this is a great way for us to actually pick up how do you match a set of good design arguments with a good enough interface that satisfies design arguments that actually materializes them, and the user can see is being manifested in the interface. And the third thing we currently thinking about is this triangle is this is our project right here, collective narrative platform, and this is Jenny Addison's API, and this is Ryan's block programming platform that allows user to trigger based on some boolean about their surrounding environment. And we are thinking about the connection from ours going out to the rest of the projects, from ours to the Find platform. We think this serves as a good way for us to really find affordance to have like a snapshot of a narrative. And it is pretty evident in the case of the running idea, because once we can identify people at exact moment based on those Boolean variables, we know they can be a good match based on those like requirements and filters. And the thing we want to focus more on is how can we make use of the CE API to build upon that platform's interactions. So the first two steps is trying to verify for this platform to have this design arguments and those arguments really make sense. And now we want to apply those arguments, try to build on the feature that's provided by the CE API. So when you're writing experience using the API, how can you, when you're writing experience using the API, how do you make new continuation and follow up on that experience using our platform? So how our platform can serve as a good way to really make the user come back and tell a community story, form a community story based on the interactions built by the CE API. So this can sound very vague now, but we think the general idea is just to build on something, build on the interaction the CE API can afford. And this is what we want to work on next quarter. So more on the technology and more on the integration between our platform with the rest of the platforms. So namely the other two. So yeah, I think hope this quarter has been really great. We learned a lot, right? And I think we should carry over the momentum next quarter and really implement some of the key things we learned in conducting research, and that's really important for us to iterate on our findings and so on.
Yeah, so like Gino said, I think a lot of this first quarter was learning how to learn in the research format and learning how to work correctly through Agile. And I think that though we're not even close to being done learning, but we're going to continue this through next quarter and hopefully into any other quarters we take DTR in.
Okay, this is it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.